It's not cool when they're bloated corpses.
Yeah, nobody wants to just become like a wheezing corpse.
Hello, welcome to the very first episode of the Midnight Seminar. My name is Steve, and I do the music for this podcast as well as help with production. The hosts of this podcast are Tara and Doug, who are both great scholars but are a little bit shy about these achievements. However, I insisted on sharing a few details about their background because I feel it's important to provide a little bit of context for these two random people you're about to encounter on the internet. Both Tara and Doug have PhDs. Tara has a PhD in history and Doug has one in philosophy, and they met teaching at one of the premier boarding schools in the United States. They both won the endowed title for Best Junior Faculty Member while working at the school, and have also both won teaching and academic awards throughout their graduate work and scholarship. Both Tara and Doug have since moved on from full-time teaching in the classroom and are pursuing awesome individual projects like this podcast, but there are many more to come. I'd emphasize that despite their high degrees, they are not stuffy people. Tara and Doug are wonderful conversationalists and are exceptional friends. Now, if everything goes according to plan, you'll never hear from me again, and I'll let Tara and Doug take it from here.
Hi, Doug!
Hello, Tara.
How are you on this fine October evening?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm enjoying the fall weather, the cool nights. Halloween is coming up, which I always like.
It is.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm great. I am really ready to talk about vampires.
All right, sweet. Me too.
I don't want to bury the lead on this one.
Yeah.
Like, who's ever listening, you're here for the vampires and we're here for the vampires. However, let's talk just quickly about what we're doing. So, in my mind, we have a historian. That's me. And we have a philosopher.
That's me.
You, Doug.
Hello.
But we're always just at the most core level, the people who want to talk about ghosts at the party.
Right.
And so that's what we're doing. So I think my vision for this, or hopefully our vision for this, was to just discuss a range of topics in a short mini series that ranges from, I'd say, quintessentially spooky, that fun element of fright, maybe to genuinely creepy. So subjects that are either offbeat or potentially off-putting.
Yeah.
Anything that we like and that might pair well with a minor key organ bop.
Yeah, that's good. I like that description.
Yes, the Midnight Seminar. Things that go bump in the night school. So I do a lot of really strange reading. I do my dark bidding on the internet, my dark wormholing. And I recently left this job where I got to teach about the history of folk magic and witchcraft persecution. So now this is my new outlet for talking and thinking about strange histories and seeing what we can learn from them. And then, as a resident philosopher, I'm hoping that you can help process these lessons to get at big questions.
Yeah.
And together we can kind of go from the relatively obscure elements of the history into sort of utterly cosmic questions and ruminate on the forgotten tidbits of lives long gone, put them into conversation with the ongoing human condition. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds great. Sign me up. Let's do it.
Okay, great. We're a classroom for the cursed. What we study in the shadows. So, okay, thank you for being here if you're listening to this. But actually, Doug, I was hoping just one more question for you. If we're blending history, philosophy, and horror, can you just kind of say what philosophy is?
It's a good question. Here's a kind of a classic definition that I like. This is by a philosopher named Wilfrid Sellars. And he said that philosophy is the study of how things in the broadest sense of that word, hang together in the broadest sense of those words. How things hang together, things construed very broadly, hanging together construed very broadly. So why do I like that? I like it because it gives the sense of the very wide scope of philosophy. So most disciplines have to carve out some territory. You have to make some foundational assumptions which structure the inquiry of that discipline. And in philosophy, everything is always up for grabs. There are no assumptions that cannot be questioned. And so it in a way, it winds up being a subject that asks about very fundamental questions. So what is the nature of being? What is the nature of existence? What is it to know something? What's the nature of knowledge? What is a human being? And there are different ways of asking these questions and different ways of trying to answer them. So you could take the question, what is a human being? And you could try to answer that from a biological perspective. That would, in this day and age, lead to some sort of evolutionary account, some explanation of how this particular kind of organism or this species relates to broader trends in the unfolding of the material world. And that's one form of analysis that can shed some light on what it is to be a human being. But I think we can all appreciate that that story leaves out something essential to our experience of what it is to be a human being. That's not how it seems to me. So maybe that's true. Maybe it's the true story. But there are other questions left over even if we accept that story. Questions about the nature of humanity. What's the nature of consciousness, which seems so essential to our humanity? Where do morals come from? What's the nature of a moral standard or a value? Is it just culturally constructed? Does it come from some divine lawgiver? Does it come, in some sense, from the universe itself? So all of these, kind of very big questions that cut to the core of human life form the subject matter of philosophy in one way of understanding it. Now, I'll stop after this, but just to acknowledge, different philosophers will answer that question in different ways. So that part, there are indeed philosophical debates about what philosophy is.
That checks out from my exposure to the field in graduate school and whatnot. But that was super helpful. Thank you so much. I feel intimidated and so excited about that. So I know that you're going to be my Dante, or no, his muse. Who is his muse? Virgil.
Yeah, that's great. Can I just say one thing about the intimidation? Because I think you're not alone in that. And it's actually, I feel really strongly, and this is important to me, that philosophy does have this reputation of being kind of intimidating or off-putting to people. It can be very jargony, it can be very abstract, and there are these really dense texts, and there can be the sense that somehow if you're not initiated into that rarefied world of jargon and lingo and all these names and theories, that philosophy is not for you. But and I'm not just saying this to make you feel better or make any listeners feel better. Philosophy is much simpler than that. The basic questions that a child can ask are philosophical questions, and children make great philosophers. My preferred audience to teach philosophy to is kids, because they're, in some sense, they're closer. They're less corrupted, I think, by the need to be super sophisticated and theoretical in their thinking, and they can just wrestle with these very basic questions in a direct way. So I really try to emphasize that element of philosophy, that it really is something everyone can access and talk about, and there's no need to use fancy names and stuff and that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I know just from being your friend how effectively you teach this stuff, and also from sharing students with you how effectively you teach this stuff. So I'm very excited for my own philosophical education through this. I think history as a field probably sounds a lot more straightforward, right? Like things that have happened in the past.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how would you define, what is history?
The way that I like to position history for students is as detective work. part of that is to make it sound rightfully sexy. But, I mean, it really is. You can dig into sources and figure out what has likely happened or find patterns from historical sources that are real. You can uncover amazing things. One of my favorite examples of that is the historian Annette Gordon Reed was the one who really kind of figured out through interrogating sources that Thomas Jefferson had children with a woman that he enslaved at Monticello. She wrote a book about this in 1997, and then DNA evidence confirmed it the following year. So that insight came from a historian.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, and that's kind of an extreme example of detective work. But you can really interrogate sources to recreate worlds and re-ask questions and figure out things that help us be better humans today. Now, that being said, I think a good historian is always concerned with empathy for historical actors within their contexts and also with perspective. So, like on the empathy piece, we're trying to understand choices and structures that people have made. That also involves accountability and genuine reckoning and honesty. So I don't want to blanket exonerate people under like the false notion that, oh, everyone was bad in this like same way in the past. I think it's unproductive to hold people up on uncomplicated pedestals, and it's also unproductive and simplistic to dismiss people as unworthy of consideration because they either did really bad things or even because they occupied some type of moral gray area doing things that we have come to see as bad. So I think good historians look at history very honestly, and they admit the limitations of their conclusions. They seek out challenges to their observations. They seek out feedback. They go through a rigorous review process. They revise their own ideas, and they land on what they think they really have determined about some element of the past. A lot of times that can help us understand something today. But do you want to talk about vampires?
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's really interesting, and I have a million follow-up questions, but I think maybe we can leave those for another day.
Yeah, I think we will steadily reveal, what it is we do in these roles. But I'll just jump in and ask you, what or who do you picture when you hear the word vampire?
Oh, good question. Yeah. I picture what I think is a classic image of a vampire. I don't know when I first came across this image. I know that it's been with me since I was a small child because one of my earliest Halloween memories is wanting to be a vampire. And so I picture like black cape, very pale face, red lips, fangs. And I remember at the time slicking my hair back for my little kid. I must have been in like kindergarten or something for my little kid vampire costume. And I remember being sad that I thought it didn't look right. And I was trying to explain to my mom like why I thought my costume wasn't working. And it was that I didn't have at the time a receding hairline. And I thought like it should go.
The widow's peak.
Yeah, and I was like, now I can do it. But at the time, my hair didn't look right. So I think a widow's peak is also part of my image of a vampire and has been since I was a small child.
Absolutely. I mean, that's like essentially the right answer.
Is that so? Would that be your answer too?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are the products of the literary and media vampires of the 20th and 21st century. You and I both grew up in the late 20th century. So yeah, we had before us the Bela Lugosi universal vampire, the I want to suck your blood, and all the depictions of Dracula. Yeah. So yes, that's absolutely where my frame of references come to. And we have in the past bonded over reading Dracula. Do you remember when you first read Dracula by Bram Stoker?
Yeah. It wasn't that long ago. It would have been 2019. And I read it one fall, and I split it between reading the text and listening to an audiobook narration. And I was doing a lot of running at the time because I was training for a marathon. and I would go on these long autumn runs through this graveyard listening to Dracula, and I have some really fond memories of that time.
You did it right.
Yeah, it was good. When did you first read it?
Yeah, I first encountered Dracula in college.
Okay.
I loved it. It's pretty amazing, and a lot in the whole history of vampirology hinges on Dracula.
Yeah.
So I'll get there eventually. Did you have ever any exposure to vampires via folklore or history?
No, I think I was pretty like kind of just affected by mainstream pop culture vampire stuff. I have like just browsed from curiosity, like I've read here and there about there's some word that I think was a Slavic word like vurdalak or something like that was a kind of vampire, and I remember checking this out on some Wikipedia page one time, but no real exposure to that.
Okay, great. Then I hope that I can teach you quite a bit today.
Please do, yes.
Yeah, my exposure was definitely literary until quite recently, although I do also have a memory of my dentist telling me a story about how he installed fangs on someone, like as crowns, sculpted as fangs, and he really talked through this person about being a consenting adult in like a real vampire community and like practicing vampires. So I knew that this was sort of a subculture. The word like sanguinophilia is coming to mind, and I think that would just mean, right, like a liking of blood or something.
Oh.
So, right, because like sanguine is blood, and there's like philia and phobia.
Yeah, okay.
I think essentially there's like a clinical vampirism that is some type of psychological.
Do these people drink blood or?
Yeah, I think that there are. I will admit right away that I genuinely don't know how to best talk about this.
Okay.
But there's a lot out there on the internet, including a 2015 Atlantic article on like how to be a real vampire. And it is sort of like just like a subculture where there is I think a pretty like careful, consensual, at least that's what it's supposed to be, exchange of blood for ritual and maybe consumption. But I don't know much about that. That would be my other little exposure to vampirism, is just kind of hearing whispers about this the same way that you would maybe encounter like Satanism as a concept. And anytime something like that, anything touching the occult, anything touching something that so many people see as dark, it is going to be distorted by the time it gets to the layperson's ears. So
yeah, fair enough.
We're not really going to talk about that again today. I just wanted to flag that is kind of another context.
Yeah.
But in October every year, some type of organic theme emerges for my Halloween season.
Okay.
And I love this. I don't know what it's going to be ahead of time. I just end up like encountering media, or something happens, or I'm visiting a place and I get sucked in to something specific and then I run with it. This year it has been vampires. My husband Steve and I are watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer in its entirety. Yeah. The best.
I haven't seen it actually, except for like the reruns that were on, like, or I guess maybe it was not even reruns when it was airing. I think when I was a kid, like occasionally it would be on TV, but I never actually sat down and watched it.
That was my exposure to it as well. I saw like the odd episode on TV while it was coming out in the 90s and early 2000s, but we're going back and watching from the beginning. I think we're in season 5 right now. I've read books on like the history of vampirism that I'll be drawing from, and I've been like incessantly crafting these little vampire poppets for, like, in the likeness of my friends.
Amazing.
It's been really fun, and I didn't feel particularly drawn to vampires. I really like Dracula. I did read Twilight. I'll get back to Twilight later, but I was not like a Twilight person. But getting to know the kind of archival vampire in addition to the archetypal vampire, has been really exciting for me. So I'd love to tell you a little bit about the history.
Yes, please do.
We can look at the history of vampirism in a lot of different ways. It's actually like a huge subject, way bigger than I expected. Involves a lot of different types of beliefs and contexts that coagulate into what we now think of as vampires.
Okay.
How many blood puns am I allowed?
I think you get unlimited, a free pass for this
No
episode.
quota?
Yeah.
Okay, well, what I mean to say is that all these different things converge into what we now think of as vampires. So I have made editorial decisions about how I'm going to keep it somewhat coherent and short, but there's definitely more room to explore.
Sounds good,
if
yeah.
anyone just can't get enough. So we're definitely going to be talking about Eastern European folklore of the undead, and more specifically, vampires. It's connected to basically the history of emergent medical science. So like disease, contagion, folk medicine, and then the rise of Western medicine. Very interesting story there. And I think we kind of can't have the conversation without landing on literature.
Yeah.
And then by the time we're in the literary vampire age, all of those characters and stories reflect human fears, fantasies, wants, and needs. And so that's where so much room opens up to talk about what this has meant for people over time. So we'll just make decisions about what media, what literature makes sense for us to talk about.
Sounds good.
Great. A current running through all of that is obviously death, whether it's actualized or it's looming near. And very connected to that is this concept of undeath. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that we can work to define that. I don't want to take it for granted uncritically.
Yeah. It's just, I find the concept of undeath, it's very interesting. And like philosophically, it's puzzling. And I've certainly thought about this and have some things to say. So I hope we can go into that.
Awesome. Yes, definitely. That's going to be a priority. I think we'll probably end with some takeaways for living people from all the vampire lore. So hopefully we're going to walk the full spectrum of like dead to undead to alive tonight.
Sounds good.
Okay, it's in basically southeastern European folklore that proto-vampires show up. And I am sure that somebody fancy in the historical field has said that or said something even better, but that's just kind of how I was making sense of these old stories in this very big sweeping history of mythological creatures. So there are ancient stories of like vague blood-sucking demon type figures from all the world over. It doesn't really make sense for us to start quite that vague, but I will start as vague as before biblical times in the Balkans and Slavic regions. Especially there were relevant tales of basically malevolent corpses.
Okay.
That makes sense. I think that that's probably still one way to define a vampire as a type of malevolent corpse, but I'm also betting that we probably don't think of vampires as very corpse-like in appearance. We definitely need to talk about corpses.
Okay.
And basically, if we're thinking of recent famous vampire iterations as like these sparkly Twilight vampires, some of the places where we've landed in very recent culture, like we need to get way grittier. We need to get way scarier. We need to completely take the sex appeal out of it and get into like the essential terror of something that is supposed to be dead, violently reanimating and attacking the living.
Yeah, when you put it that way with that tone, it doesn't sound nearly as sexy as the movies make it out to be.
No, right. If we can kind of get back to this grime and grit and terror, we're seeing something much more like the vampiric creatures, not yet called vampires, but those types of creatures out of lore.
Yeah.
I'll just say, like all across Europe and really all across the world, there were all sorts of stuff like floating between the lands of the living and the dead. And we still use language about like a veil between the living and the dead, So we're still like contemplating how those two planes intersect and interact, but definitely basically from time immemorial, people were asking those questions as well. In the European traditions, there were like actual threats from corpses infected with what we would come to understand as vampirism. And proto-vampire hunting is as old as the proto-vampirism, right? Like, you got to do something about it if it's allegedly happening. A lot of this is probably going to sound like campfire tales, essentially.
Okay.
Like oral histories with some type of lessons passed down. But there were genuine concerns about physical corpses, and real people took real measures to ward off vampirism or kill vampires. Like, kill for a second time, I guess. People manipulated the bodies of suspected vampires by exhuming their corpses, cutting off their heads, staking them, flipping them upside down in the grave, or otherwise like dismembering and rearranging their parts to treat the condition, to put the body to rest. And those are things that really clearly show up in the archaeological record.
Oh,
Exhumed
wow.
grave sites show this. So we know that it happened. And the general folklore that I'm talking about right now really applies to centuries of history. But we'll talk about when it kind of peaks and applies most viscerally. Following me so far?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay. Fears of vampires tended to center on like strange deaths or disease outbreaks, series of misfortunes plaguing a family or a particular community. There were debates about what exactly caused it, and those are very dependent on region, but the uncertainty or tragedy surrounding certain deaths were really big. Fun fact, kind of, this all more or less gets transplanted to the American colonies and the United States. And even as an American historian, I didn't know very much about this. Through the whole 19th century, there is a vampire panic in New England, maybe most acutely in Rhode Island. So shout out to anybody who's listening from Rhode Island.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've never heard of this. Tell me about the vampire
Yes, and
panic.
you and I are both New England residents. So I read a book about this. It's called Food for the Dead on the Trail of New England's Vampires. It's by a folklorist, Michael E. Bell. And the book kind of tells the story of that folklorist researching a series of exhumations that show up in the record. Exhumations, like pulling people up out of the grave, and townspeople would get together. They would do this with the families. They would take out the hearts of the cadavers and burn them. This is essentially a folk medicine practice to cure the vampirism, but they wouldn't have used that word, and they wouldn't have thought of what they were doing as like vampire hunting.
Interesting.
Commentators might have. The last exhumation of this kind that we know of actually happened shockingly recently. I think it was 1897.
Oh, wow.
In Rhode Island. And at the time, there was this tension between science and what the more science-minded would have seen as superstition. But I didn't want to position this whole history in Europe. I think it's pretty interesting that it does jump to New England, particularly where like the renegade, not Puritans lived.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, because if you think about this, literally what was happening, this is a big perversion of preferred Christian burial practices. And burial is very important in certain Christian sects. So you have to be willing to go against norms in that way to do this. And it happened again all through the 19th century.
When this is happening in Rhode Island and the rest of New England, and they're not thinking of it as vampirism, do you have any sense of how they did understand what was happening? What did they think they were fighting or killing or preventing by mutilating these corpses?
Right. Especially because these are not people directly immigrating from somewhere in the Balkans or anything. The book that I read really told this story alongside the story of tuberculosis consumption as they would have understood it.
Oh, wow.
The belief seemed to be that as certain family lines in particular died off one by one, maybe a bunch of siblings die from consumption one after the other, that there must be something supernatural happening, because tuberculosis was a hard disease to understand, and it killed so many people.
Yeah.
And so it seems on the surface really mysterious. So the thought was that a recently deceased corpse was somehow feeding off of the life force, aka the blood, of their living relatives in order to maintain some type of undeath.
That is terrifying.
It is terrifying.
That's like almost scarier, I think, than the other image of a vampire as this animated bloodsucker. Like there's something really sinister and frightening about that picture.
I thought so too, especially because they're not necessarily coming up out of the grave, which means there's some type of sentience happening while this person is buried underground. And, the legends that then graph future vampire lore onto these stories will reinvent these stories as, oh, they did raise from the grave, they bit their family's necks or whatever. But it wasn't that literary.
Yeah, I see.
At the time. It was this idea that you could intervene in that process by exhuming the body and then, again, like doing one of these folk medicine practices to put it to rest. And this all hinged on when they exhumed and opened up the coffins, there are all of these documented stories of the corpses not appearing to be decayed.
Yeah, that's something I've read a bit about that.
Yes, this is all before embalming. So blood is never drained from these bodies before they're put underground. Corpses bloat, they move. I think I have more notes on this, so we'll get more into this later, like the actual kind of nitty-gritty of the burial stuff. But they are finding evidence, right, of what they're afraid of. They open up the graves and there's been some type of movement in there. They might see what looks like blood on the lips. They open up the hearts and they find what they think is fresh blood in the heart.
Oh, yeah, that's that's terrifying.
The indication, the proof positive that this corpse is somehow absorbing the essential life force of the relatives. Yes. So, yeah, Americans, this is for us too.
Okay, yeah. Good to know. We've got our own homegrown vampires.
We do. Yeah, we definitely drew from Europe via not indirect channels, but again, this is not like Serbian immigrants coming and living in Rhode Island. This is a whole belief system permeating through Europe, through England, and eventually to the United States. So it just won't die. But I'll jump back to Europe for a second.
Yeah, let's go back.
The Slavic vampire figures are where a lot of our modern lore is rooted. They were shapeshifters. They could slink into homes. They drank blood. They converted others into vampires. They had considerable power over the elements. They could, create like plagues. And they didn't decay in death. And I'm saying death because they're supposed to be dead. This is a literal corpse, but again, we do get to undeath eventually. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, it's tricky to like how to even talk about that.
It is, yes. According to Nick Groom, who wrote this recent The Vampire: A New History, we land on what we think of as vampires in the early 1700s. So he says vampires, quote, came into being when Enlightenment rationality encountered East European folklore. Okay, so there's a really fun dissertation from 1679. Again, we're going to land on vampires as we know them in the early 18th century. So here at the end of the 17th, I don't speak Latin. I'll give it a try. Dissertatio de Masticatione Mortuorum by Philip Rohr.
Sounds Latin to me.
AKA Dissertation on the Chewing of the Dead, written by a theologian.
That's gruesome. I love that. What a great title. I wish my dissertation had such a good title.
Right? I know, time. Corpses don't always behave like they're supposed to. And this dissertation was concerned with like post-mortem weirdness. He was undertaking a theological and, again, like in the context of the time, a practical exploration of how to cope with public panic about corpses. In this case, appearing to eat their own burial shrouds. And then on top of that, make plagues and terrorize the living. And this would have been in and around the Austrian Empire, into Serbia and Hungary. We're still in that part of the world. So there's a lot of religious debate in the post-Reformation world. I'm not going to get too into it, but like Protestants sometimes writing off vampires as Catholic superstitions. Vampires are not in the Bible. Ghosts and demons are. That's maybe something to consider. But social concerns all have like religious dimensions throughout the 1600s. So we're in that territory. But we have vampire panic, again, responding to like real evidence of subterranean movement of corpses. The thing with the burial shrouds is you'd have these thin linens covering a corpse's face. Okay. And if, little critters get in there, these are not embalmed corpses. Again, their fluids have not been drained. They have not been preserved artificially in any way. And so you have like the putrefaction of these thin linens on the faces. You might get some jerky movements from bloating or from an animal getting in there, and there appear to be like bite marks in some of these. Again, a lot of ways that something can appear to have been corporeal reanimation.
Man, that like if you just like, I'm sure that some mortician with proper training could come up with like a satisfying explanation for physical processes that are causing things to pop and wiggle or whatever. But if you don't know that stuff and you exhume some body in the midst of a plague, yes, and you find this going on, that is utterly terrifying.
Yes. For some like medical grounding, people knew about decomposition, right? They had models to work from, but there's more room for variation in the decomposition process than one might expect. And bodies like ooze or bloat or remain shockingly intact. And there's reasons why they might have like what they often kind of called a rosy complexion, red lips. It might look like there's blood on lips as bodies like expel various substances. And again, like when they dug out the hearts, there might be like congealed blood or some other fluid in there. So the bloating might not sound surprising. I think we know like corpses bloat. That has become, I guess, common knowledge. We see maybe like, I saw like a seal washed up on the shore that had bloated or whatever. But a lot of like vampirologists have reminded us that other things happen to human corpses. Lips shrivel up and it can make your teeth look elongated. The same thing happens with your fingertips and your nails might look extended.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And on, again, more medical grounding on the contagion piece, we don't have modern germ theory until the 1860s.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. It seems to me that, I mean, disease in general would have been terrifying. And, I mean, it's still terrifying.
Yes.
But there's something about being able to explain disease, like having an adequate theory about its causes removes some of the terror because it becomes, to some degree less mysterious. But if you're just seeing, like within a family, people just start dying. Young, healthy people just start hacking up blood or whatever. Yes. Like that's really scary. And if there's that you don't even have, it's not just that you don't know like what disease is it. You don't even know how this sort of thing could happen. So yeah, that seems like a fertile ground for all kinds of fear to start growing and to create some kind of story that's going to to help you explain or try to explain what's going on here.
Absolutely. I think, what I'm partially trying to do is just like affirm the beliefs and actions of these people who were observing real things and trying to respond to them and responded as a community in a lot of cases, which I think is really interesting. People came together for this.
I mean, if I could just mention also another element of this, because you did stress the importance of the religious context. I think it may be helpful to just also bear in mind, like if you live in a culture where it's more or less unquestioned by most people that there's such a thing as a soul, that the death of the physical body is not the permanent end, then it opens up the possibility that like all kinds of mysterious stuff can happen after death. And particularly if you believe in the possibility of the resurrection, which is not, like absolutely not what's supposed to be happening here, but it's like you kind of start to think, well, I don't know, like there's that thing that could happen, which is where God, resurrects the dead. But could there be something more sinister going on where the dead are being animated in some other way? And that's like, it's not a big leap if you're already living within that conceptual framework.
Absolutely. And it does open a host of theological problems because if this is the work of Satan does not have the power to resurrect. That is God's power alone. And so is this a farce? Is like, what is happening here? I think it is really hard for us in the modern world to reconstruct this terror.
Yeah.
And it helps, I think, to try to sit with it for a second in the belief systems and with, again, the physical evidence of what they are seeing in these exhumed coffins. People were smart in the past. And, even before germ theory, people have some pretty clever ideas about contagion and like miasma and stuff. It's a while until they land on what we have continued to endorse with further scientific research, but these are not stupid people, and writing it off as like silly superstition, which again, as we get into the 19th century, there are many commentators who will do that, who write this off as stupid superstition. We see Jonathan Harker in Dracula, question the people he meets on his travels as they indicate to him that he is going into great danger visiting the Count. And guess what? Those people are right.
Yeah, I really like that part of the Dracula story, actually. I like that
I do too.
It captures really well the person is the physical traveling of Jonathan Harker into this strange and mysterious land mirrors or it represents the conceptual shift into a different way of seeing the world that's far scarier and far more mysterious.
And science alone cannot save you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, if I can keep you in the grave for just one more fun fact.
But take me back to the grave.
Corpses can groan and moan.
No, hold on. Wait a minute.
Yes,
I don't know about that. Tell me more.
I will walk you through this. So basically, just like this is more gas. Corpses are very gassy.
Okay.
And again, pre-embalming.
Oh, yeah. All right. So
yes,
like the way a stomach might make a sound or something, that stuff can happen. Okay. But not like vocal cords, right? Or like
No.
Okay.
Nothing that actually is reanimation, but something again that creates observable evidence for people looking into this. Basically like a dead body. I kind of think of it as like an instrument. You can move air through it and it'll make noise. Horrific.
Yeah, that's gruesome.
Take a stake a person through the heart, and there will be a sudden release of gas in that corpse that might reasonably have a noise. And so there were stories of staking the heart, and then this groan or this noise comes out. It seems so unnatural, right? The body is responding to what you are doing to it. And it is so multi-sensory. You're seeing this strange stuff and you are hearing this strange stuff. This is really terrifying territory. And also, you might have loved this person.
Yeah, this is super helpful, actually. Like, it really paints a rich context for me to try to imagine what it would have been like to be in the grip of these fears. And yeah, I think it does help me to see how it's more than, it's not idle superstition. It's not people sitting around and just being like, wow, I heard this spooky thing can happen.
Yes.
Like what you're describing is a very visceral, embodied sensory experience that could lead a reasonable person to believe that like there's something going on with that corpse.
Right. Yes. This is why I opened saying they sound like campfire tales.
Yeah.
And also are not.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that one dissertation. There are lots of other dissertations and like treatises of that type in the late 1600s, early 1700s. That same author, Nick Groom, noted that between 1732 and 1736, there were at least 12 books, 4 dissertations, and 22 what he calls learned treatises published on vampires.
Wow. In 4 years.
Yes. Yes. And again, there is like skepticism and belief in this period. So it's a whole kind of dialogue. Some see the concept as figurative, others as literal. I'll also add, on this same general time period, 2 of the best known documented cases of vampires, as in like there was an individual in the historical record treated as a vampire in death, and with a community response, like the treatment, come from 1725 and 1726 in Serbia. They're the cases of Peter Blagojevich and Arnold Powell. I saw it both ways. Okay. So if you start digging into the folklore and history, you eventually come across those names. Actually, probably come across them pretty quickly. So again, that's all in this early 1700s moment. We get Gothic literature shortly after that. Right after like the mid 1700s, 1760s, vampires find a home in Gothic literature. And that starts a whole new series of conversations about them. There is still widespread belief in vampires as real entities. There are also people decrying them as superstitions. Literature is going to become a battleground to parse out and have that conversation. It really becomes the most important site for vampire legend. The Vampire, Vampyre, 1819. This is a very famous book. I have to say I knew almost nothing about it. Do you know of it?
Probably no more than you did before you looked into it. Like, I've heard of it. I know vaguely of it, but I don't really know much about it.
We get an English language work. We get an aristocratic vampire. It's familiar to us now. It actually stemmed from the same literary contest that produced Frankenstein.
Oh, that's cool. No, I didn't know that. Wow. Yes. Okay. Dude, that's awesome. 2 of our great monsters emerged from the same... Like, imagine if that contest had never been. We would be so impoverished.
I know. Good on them. Lord Ruthven is our vampire, and he is seductive.
All right, okay.
So we get that too. It's really popular, but it inspires like plays and operas that tour, and that popularizes the story even more. So now we're getting into like pop culture interest in vampires. In the 1840s, we start getting the penny dreadfuls. Mm-hmm. Serial installments of a story, buy them for a penny each. Very sensational, lurid tales of mystery and murder. Vampires fit that bill very well. They're for the masses. This is not high literature. Shout out to Varney the Vampire. Have you read Carmilla?
I have, yeah. I read that one around the same time that I was describing when I was running in the graveyard. Yeah.
Yes, love Carmilla. We get the female vampire with Carmilla, 1872, Sheridan Le Fanu. It's erotic. You're seeing the sexual repression and expression in the writing. We get some queer desire in that, as well as in Dracula. And I think Carmilla is pretty influential on Dracula. Dracula by Bram Stoker comes in 1897. So
Yeah.
just 2 decades later. Between those publications, just shout out to Mercy Brown. Mercy Lewis was a figure in the Salem witch trials, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some future point. Mercy Brown is the last known exhumed accused vampire in the United States, Rhode Island, 1892.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So that's right before Dracula. And again, it is pretty impossible to overstate the importance of Dracula in this whole equation. It is the A standard now.
Yeah.
It is the iconic vampire story forever. And ever since it's reimagined, it's parodied, its imprint is completely irrevocable. Like, in a word, it is canonical vampiredom.
Yeah.
2 words. And it's also a turning point for how people imagine vampires. It didn't necessarily invent the themes that it explored, but it is like all in there. So there's like the foreign threat. There is the class threat, right? His power is enabled from wealth. Of course, there is blood-sucking, conversion of people into vampires. He's predatory, pretty indiscriminately so. There's gendered violence and the eroticism and the homoeroticism. And Dracula brings the ancient vampire into the modern world. The book talks about telegraphs, solicitors, blood transfusions. So this is folklore meeting modern science in a story. And that tension had been there in the real history too. Again, like Jonathan Harker encounters villagers on his way to the castle and he thinks they're superstitious. He's familiar with the concept of a vampire, but it takes him some time to be convinced. And then he is screwed.
Yeah.
And in that book, like Van Helsing's the best character, such a good character.
I love that character.
In that character, like, he is the meeting of the learned, accomplished, and acclaimed mind with the believer in the supernatural. And he's not bogged down by reason, which is so important in the era. And that is, we kind of got at this before that, but that is one of the crucial interventions that the book makes, right? The insistence that there is a limit on the value of reason. It is not going to be science that beats the vampires. The answers are actually in old practices and oral legends, and they come from everyday people, like problem solving in their communities. It does bring us back to the real history of confronting vampirism and the ways that it was understood in the past. And Dracula is like the collective nightmare for the age, right? Like, knowledge does not help you see in the dark.
Yeah. There's a passage that I really like.
I would love for you to read a passage.
I have it here with me because I thought it might be relevant when we talk about what the French philosophers were up to, but it's probably even more relevant to what you're pointing to right now. So this is in chapter 3, and at this point in the book, Harker is in the castle, and he is starting. He's seen enough that he knows, like, something unnatural is going on here. He's terrified. He knows that this man has some kind of powers. He has seen him. I think he says he's seen him again go out in his lizard fashion. So crawling on the wall and all that stuff. And here's the passage. He says, "My lamp seemed to be of little effect in the brilliant moonlight, but I was glad to have it with me, for there was a dread loneliness in the place which chilled my heart and made my nerves tremble. Still, it was better than living alone in the rooms which I had come to hate from the presence of the Count, and after trying a little to school my nerves, I found a soft quietude come over me. Here I am, sitting at a little oak table, where in old times possibly some fair lady sat to pen with much thought and many blushes her ill-spelt love letter, and writing in my diary in shorthand all that has happened since I closed it last." And now here's the part that I think is most interesting. "It is the 19th century, up to date with a vengeance, and yet, unless my senses deceive me, the old centuries had and have powers of their own which mere modernity cannot kill." So that I love. Can I read? I'll read that last sentence.
Yes.
The last two sentences. It is the 19th century, up to date with a vengeance, and yet, unless my senses deceive me, the old centuries had and have powers of their own, which mere modernity cannot kill. Modernity in scare quotes, at least in the edition I'm reading. Yeah, so there's something really interesting about that, and there's a self-consciousness that the novel has about this problem that it's posing.
Yeah, that is the perfect quote. Oh, it is so good. Yeah, so I had forgotten how explicit it was in the text then. I'll quickly run through a couple more and then we'll get to the big questions. Nosferatu comes out in 1927. It is a Dracula ripoff. It's a cool movie, iconic imagery. We got Count Orlok. We get that famous shadow silhouette scene. Bela Lugosi as the universal monster. Dracula comes out in 1931, and that is basically how we picture Dracula. Hugely influential. Jumping ahead a little bit more. The 1970s and 75, we get Stephen King's Salem's Lot. And the next year, we get Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. Kind of an interesting pairing because they're very different portrayals of vampires between them, right? We get the invading monsters in your hometown from King, and we get a sympathetic, like, tragic figure in Rice. But what they do have in common is that they stick vampires in contemporary, believable settings. We aren't like at manor houses or castles. We're not even remote. We're also in the United States.
Yeah.
I think Anne Rice's book, the story floats between a couple of cities abroad and in the US, but these are American stories, which is it maybe makes sense as like pop culture continues to kind of consolidate into the United States for Western pop culture more broadly. But that is a big breach from the old like Slavic lore and everything. However, there's always that stamp of Transylvania on vampires. So I don't know. It's interesting there to think of them as potentially American or not. Quick shout out to Fright Night, 1985. Have you seen Fright Night?
No, I haven't.
Such an underrated, goofy ass 1980s horror movie. Buffy the Vampire Slayer airs in 1997. You know, it rocks. But the vampires are expendable. They're very plentiful. Long live Spike. You got to watch the show so we can talk about Spike.
Who's Spike?
He's just one of the vampires, but he's hilarious. Okay. One of my favorite elements of the vampires in the show is that they will like cover themselves in fabric to run through sunlight, and they'll just kind of mildly smoke. Like it's not sustainable for them, but they'll do it just for transportation. So like trench coats are helpful for them.
That's funny. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I mean, the whole show is very much in the like girl power moment of the 90s, and it's, you know, she's the hero as the vampire slayer. Right. So I'd say they're fairly simplistic, but it just keeps vampires in huge popular culture. Of course, we get Twilight that starts in 2005. It's such a big hit. There's good vampires and bad vampires. There's romance. We get vegetarian vampires. They're sparkly in the sun. They do not burst into flames. They have like individual random supernatural powers and can help humans. They phase out some of the old trappings like garlic and crosses. I think they're basically kind of depicted as superheroes, and that is very much in line with other media.
Okay, yeah.
And so, yeah, then we're there. I mean, we could name so many other little things, but the new Nosferatu movie, the Robert Eggers one with Bill Skarsgård, was just 2024. Yeah. And we still love vampires, you know?
Yeah. So, yeah, there's something there that's not going away. What stands out to me from the history you're telling is the real creative potential of this archetype of the vampire. Like, I was interested to learn when I looked into this that the idea of a vampire is relatively recent. I had tended to assume it would be ancient, like just thousands of years old, and that it kind of emerges in the form that we now have, you know, as as late as, what was it, sometime in the 1700s,
Yeah, early
right?
1700s, according to Nick Groom's interpretation. Again, there's like these looser concepts of the undead and threats from corpses. But the argument there is that the vampire comes out of the Enlightenment, essentially.
And that's really interesting to me, that the Enlightenment as a historical moment is a time where people see themselves as sweeping away the shroud of superstition and shining the light of reason onto the world, rendering everything neat and clean and intelligible. And in that time period, we get the notion of a vampire, which is in many ways, like antithetical to that picture. So that's really interesting. And then just listening to the history that you've given, it's also interesting to me the endless creative potential of this concept. So how it can be adapted to the American context, how vampires can be made grotesque and hideous, or like sexy and seductive. How they can be made,
like almost the pinnacle of human fitness rather than the antithesis, because we eventually get characters in literature who want to become vampires, and that is way more sensical once they're like cool and can do all these things.
Yeah,
it's not cool when they're bloated corpses.
Yeah, nobody wants to just become like a wheezing corpse. Or even a malevolent corpse, I think, is not very appealing.
No, I wouldn't say so. Okay, can you help me understand? This became like an open conversation among Enlightenment philosophers.
It did, indeed, yeah. So, I'd love to talk a bit about that. I have a quote here. Actually, I have two quotes. Let me think which one I want to...
Can you also situate us a little bit in time and space? I know that we're going to hear some familiar names of philosophers I've read and would recognize readily, I think, as most people would, but I wouldn't actually be able to put my finger on what I should know Voltaire from.
Yeah, so the two kind of philosophers who I came across who wrote stuff on this, and I think there were more, are Rousseau and Voltaire. These are French Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century. So writing in the quotes that I'll read are in the 1760s and 1770s. And yeah, these thinkers were known for many things. Rousseau in particular is known for a lot of his political works. Work on the idea of the social contract, work on the idea of democracy and the popular will. And Voltaire is known as, he was kind of a witty satirist who was very much a champion of reason and the power of reason to settle important philosophical questions. Does that give you enough context? Do you want more?
Yes, very much. No, that is good.
Okay. Also, these people, maybe I should just mention, both of them were much more than philosophers. They also wrote all kinds of other stuff, and they were intellectual celebrities of their time.
Right. This is why you get democracy one day and vampires.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. Very wide-reaching in their research interests. So here's a quote from Rousseau. This is in a letter that he wrote. And this is fascinating to me. He says, "If there is a well-attested history in the world, it is that of the vampires. Nothing is missing from it. Interrogations, certifications by notables, surgeons, parish priests, magistrates. The judicial proof is one of the most complete." So that's Rousseau writing about vampires. But what comes after is crucial. Okay. So this is the twist. He says, "And with all that, who believes in vampires? Will we all be damned for not having believed?" So that's interesting. Let me come back to that, but I'll just add the quote from Voltaire which is interesting. So this is from 1772. He has an entry on vampires for a work that he wrote, which was a kind of like encyclopedia. And he begins that entry on vampires with the following quote, "What?" That is, what with an exclamation mark. This is translated from French, and I don't read French, so I don't know what it is in French. What? But what? Is it in our 18th century that vampires exist? Is it after the reigns of Locke, Shaftesbury, Trenchard, and Collins? These are, empirically minded philosophers who came before him. Is it under those of, and then a bunch of other names that I don't even know, is it under all of these people that we believe in vampires? So basically saying, I mean, both of them are saying in slightly different ways, look, why is it that in this moment in history, when everything is pointing to the development of a new way of thinking about the world and our place in it, a naturalistic way, you could say, where we're finally starting to dispel darkness and mystery from the world. We're finally starting to get a straight handle on the nature of human life and the world that we live in. And now people are bringing up this idea of a vampire. Like, it just seems so out of place. And so really these philosophers at least were hard on the idea of vampires. They were skeptical. And the point that now Voltaire, in the quote I read, he doesn't really have a point. He's just expressing incredulity. This is what in philosophy we sometimes call this the argument from the incredulous stare. So somebody says something and you think they're wrong, and rather than bothering to refute them, you just look at them with a look of like amazement, like how could you possibly believe that? And in fact, this one in the world of philosophy, one has to endure this stare all the time. You get quite used to it. You say things and people just look at you like you're a total idiot. That's basically what Voltaire is doing, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Rousseau has I think his point is a little more interesting. Because he's acknowledging that there is, in a sense, all of this, what we might call indirect evidence supporting vampires. It's the most well-attested history in the world. Now, that's got to be a bit of an exaggeration on his part.
Sure.
But he's like, look, there's all these records, right? People have done interrogations. Surgeons have testified, the priests, the magistrates. It's all there. And yet, there's something about the idea of a vampire that I think he's saying, it can't command my belief. And so there's something about the power of the mind, the power of reason, and this is me extrapolating here from what he's saying, that it can't be held hostage to the opinions of the many. It can't, so that there's no amount of indirect evidence, other people saying, I saw it, that could support something as wild as this. And that's interesting because it raises the question, like, well, what are the standards of belief? If it's not trusting what the well-attested histories say, then what standards are you relying on to form your beliefs about whether something exists or not?
Well, I wanted to ask you if you thought that any of the questions that they were asking, like vis-a-vis the vampire, still felt relevant. Because I feel like I hear echoes of pretty relevant stuff in there. But what do you think about those questions or that conversation in a modern context?
I don't know, because I think the context in one way is very different. That is, I think the modern, like our contemporary fascination with vampires is very different from the concern with vampires that these two were responding to. I think that many people don't believe in the literal existence of vampires as described in these tales nowadays.
Yeah.
And so there's less of a need, I think, for someone like a philosopher to try to disprove the existence of this sort of thing. If anything, the burden is on the one who believes in vampires, just culturally speaking. That's most people would not be, I think, on your side there.
Yeah.
But I think in general, the question of how to think about the norms that govern responsible belief, particularly when we're trying to weigh indirect evidence in the form of testimony. A bunch of people say that X is true, and yet X seems fantastical or impossible or ridiculous to me. How should I make up my mind about that? That continues, I think, to be a really hard question, and I'm not sure we have a good answer. And I think that in different cases, people are drawn in different directions on that.
Yes, you said it so much better than I would have, but that's what I was trying to think. I guess I picture, I think we've, as a Western culture, kind of landed on vampires. We don't think that they're real, but what about alien encounters or cryptid sightings or even the existence of angels? Mm-hmm. If you look into studies, a lot of Americans, the only studies I know of, poll Americans, but believe in those things. And I often feel myself, especially when you end up in a wormhole and hearing this, what feels like very credible witness testimony. And I always feel like these people are not stupid, and they are not lying, at least on purpose. Yeah. And I don't know what to do with that, because I don't believe in these things, Yeah. It feels very mean to just dismiss that. And it really is insulting to people who think they have encountered something. So I kind of just land on, I don't know how to feel about this.
Yeah, for me, a lot depends on the case. And I tend to take these matters on a case-by-case basis. I think in some cases, I'm inclined to say, who knows? In other cases, I'm inclined to say that seems, I don't know, seems like you were subject to some kind of illusion. It seems like this is I don't know, like something's going wrong somewhere. But I'm very interested in that impulse to explain away. And what it says about our convictions and our worldview. So if somebody told me that they saw an alien spaceship, right, immediately my mind would assume you probably didn't see it. Like there's all these other explanations. And interestingly, my mind goes there, even though I don't have any clue what the other explanations are. I just assume there are some other explanations, and they're going to be better than whatever you say. But I've been on the receiving end of this attitude in ways that I find maddening, where there are certain things that I'm interested in that are quite outside the realm of like a modern materialistic explanation of the world. Not necessarily connected to vampires, but there are philosophical questions like the nature of consciousness that interest me. And I think there just is no plausible, anything like nothing remotely plausible in terms of a materialist scientific explanation of consciousness. A lot of people will disagree with that, and I'm not going to get into the arguments. Okay. But in general, what people will say is, well, we don't know what the explanation is, but for sure, there's got to be one. And they assume that my view, which is something like a consciousness is just fundamentally mysterious. It's a non-physical aspect of reality that will never be comprehended through physical explanations. They assume that that's the outlier. That's the wild. That's the UFO in the sky. That's Bigfoot in the woods. Yeah. And they're going to find the right explanation someday if they just get the right algorithm or the right whatever. And I find this maddening because it seems to me it seems very dogmatic that they're just saying, well, my view is right, so, and your view doesn't fit into my worldview, so I'm sure I'll get the true explanation someday.
I think I have encountered a scenario that if I was inclined towards belief would have convinced me that ghosts are real.
Oh.
And yet, I think I'll save the story for another day, but...
Cliffhanger.
What I've actually made of that pretty visceral experience was that, well, I was probably somewhere between wakefulness and sleeping, and I'm pretty comfortable thinking that my brain played some tricks on me because it actually seems perfectly within the realm of possibility when you bring in all the strange stuff that happens with perception between being asleep and being awake.
Yeah.
But I have always had the sense that if I was inclined towards belief, I would be, someone with a story saying, you weren't there, I know what I experienced. I'm just very comfortable saying, I don't know what I experienced, right? Like, we don't know all that much about the human brain. And when it gets to the mind and, again, like consciousness, we super don't know. So I feel myself thinking that there are so many answers there, but I still find that so mysterious and like kind of magical. Like, I don't know how far those explanations go into territory that a lot of people dismiss now as being outlandish. At the same time, when people tell me that Bigfoot floats between planes of existence and speaks to them telepathically and then abducts them into a spacecraft, that is way too far out for me, Yeah,
yeah.
We're still kind of dancing on what does it mean to be undead.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and because a lot of things live generally in that space, and it's not something that I think I immediately understand.
So that's really interesting to me because the concept of undeath, like an undead being, it sounds like it should be contradictory. It shouldn't make sense on the face of it. The idea of the living dead is, right? It's like, you look, you're either dead or you're alive. There can't be a living dead. What does that even mean? It shouldn't make sense. And yet it certainly makes enough sense for people to like talk about it and make movies about it and enjoy reading about it and speculating about it. So it's not totally nonsensical in the way that like, the idea of a square circle is. That literally makes no sense. There couldn't be such a thing as a square circle. But the idea of the living dead, the undead, it does seem to make some kind of sense. So what's going on there? And I've thought about this, and here's what I've come up with. This is just my own kind of armchair speculations. So I'm sure that some people have written about this and probably have more intelligent things to say. But the idea of a living being used to be, I would say, like classically speaking, the idea of a living being was the idea of an animate being. The difference between living and not living is the difference between being animate and inanimate. In the Western tradition, the idea of animacy is very closely bound up with the idea of the soul. So Greek philosopher Aristotle has a very famous work on the nature of life and the soul and human life called, the Greek title is On the Soul. But it's known to most people, and philosophers now study it under its Latin title, which is De Anima, which is the Latin way of saying that. So the idea of soul and animation are very closely tied together. And when you get something like undeath, so this is a living, like let's say a human being who has died. So the human has lost animacy, has lost the soul. The soul has done something else. It's gone to some other place, or it's just gone, or whatever. And then the body becomes reanimated by something else, which is not a life force. It's not the soul. So there has to be conceptual space in the idea of the undead for the possibility of animacy, having that notion of aliveness, but no soul, no spirit, no life force even. You're animated by something other than what animates ordinary human beings. So what is that something else? It could be like an evil force. It could be, I don't know, possession, the devil, malevolence, right? But there's something else putting the limbs in motion. There's some other ghost in the machine, which is not a soul.
Yeah.
And that I think is the essence of the idea of undeath. Animacy, not through traditional life force.
That's also like really scary.
It is.
Right? It's your body and your likeness, but it's not you.
Yeah. And that so then it gets really interesting. And this is, I should say, this is also something that came up when I was poking around reading about what the French philosophers were thinking about philosophically in regards to vampires. That one thing that's interesting about vampires is that they certainly seem to be people, basically, people with special powers. They have all the power of reason and rationality. They can understand things. They can form relationships. They have desires and plans and wishes. And all of that was traditionally thought to be the province of the human being, because the human being has reason, which was very closely tied up with the soul again. And so here you have the idea of a being which has all of these properties that seem to be quintessentially human, and yet it's not human. And presumably it doesn't have a soul or anything like a soul. And so you kind of start to lose your grip on what a vampire is, and possibly even what a person is. So like if I were to turn into a vampire, presumably I would still have some of my, right? Like some of my personality traits would persist. Some of my memories, it's not like I just lose my sense of everything that happened. And yet there has to be some profound sense in which that being is no longer me. I think, at least, if I'm truly dead and reanimated, then what animates me now has to be gone, and something else has to be moving me fundamentally.
Yeah, and something has corrupted you.
Yeah.
Turning you from a virtuous being into the bloodlusting killer.
Yeah.
Woof. I mean, I think, like, if we ask ourselves, why do we keep resurrecting the vampire, and against all odds finding it new homes and new contexts, it has to be because it is the mirror and the foil for humanity, and that it has been with us to help us confront the darkness of humanity, really, at its core. And probably that's what a lot of monsters help us do over time. But the vampire has really, like, withstood the test of time, which is funny because this is all about quasi-corpses that don't decay.
Yeah, so they have a double immortality, right?
They do. Yeah, because in order to ask yourself what the nature of death is, I guess you have to understand the nature of life.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to, like, why there is a field of philosophy, because there are so many ways to ask and answer that question.
Indeed. Yes. What is the nature of life?
What do you think you will take away from this conversation that will help you appreciate vampires this Halloween season?
Oh, that's a nice question. Give me a minute to think about that. Honestly, I think the thing that's going to stay with me the most is just imagining the terror of not knowing the disease case, the terror of feeling that somehow the dead body of a loved one is sapping the life force of my family or myself. Like, just that case really is scary and shook me when I pondered it. And more generally, I think just an appreciation of the perspective of the people who were trying to make sense of these bizarre and terrifying findings around corpses. Like, just really hearing the details of that and trying to picture that has given me a newfound appreciation for the terror of the vampire.
Well, good. That makes me happy to hear as a historian. Why did the vampire go to the doctor?
He wanted some blood.
It was coffin!
Good. I like that one.
All right. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Doug.
thank you, Tara.
I'll talk to you soon about something else very strange.
What's that?
Whatever topic we do next.
Oh, okay. Cool. All right.
All right, class is adjourned. Thanks for listening. Your hosts are Tara and Doug. The podcast is produced by Tara and Steve. Steve does the sound design as well. And you, dear listener, are the most important part. Thanks for being here.